Alexander the Great, critically wounded in battle and dying, reportedly gave his signet ring to his second in command, Perdiccas, with a cryptic instruction that his empire should go to the strongest. Predictably, this triggered a power struggle among his generals, and 20 years later, the empire, which stretched from Macedon across Egypt and all the way to the Indus River, had disintegrated. But what makes it even more impressive is that the empire had not existed when Alexander was born. The man literally created the empire in his lifetime, though it did not long survive his death. And that's what I want to talk about today. One and done empires that pop up in the lifetime of one man and disintegrate after he is gone. Welcome to another episode of Just in Time Worldbuilding with your host, Marie Mullaney. We'll start our discussion by talking about how in the heck Alexander's pop-up empire came to be. The perfect storm. The sudden emergence and subsequent fragmentation of the empire of Alexander represents one of the most significant inflection points in ancient historiography. The guy didn't just conquer his neighbors. He kicked the ass of a millennia-old administrative and territorial structures of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. And I mean, that is truly impressive. Now, if you go back to the 19th century, they'll tell you all about the great man theory, which is a historical theory popularized by Thomas Carlyle. It posits that history is the biography of unique, divinely inspired individuals whose traits, intellect, courage, and leadership act as primary drivers of change. Basically, history is always main character energy. So, generally speaking, I call bullcrap on this. The circumstances of history tend to shape the people who respond to those circumstances in a kind of chicken and egg moment. Basically, if Caesar hadn't ended the Roman Republic, someone else would have. The Roman Republic had simply grown too heavy for governance to continue. Now, as I've said before, this doesn't mean that Julius Gaius Caesar had no impact on history. Obviously, he had an enormous impact on history. The word Kaiser comes from his name. But the events would have played out in roughly the same way, even if someone else was the linchpin in bringing down the empire, because the whole shape of the republic was tottering towards collapse and the formation of empire. However, the same doesn't quite apply to Alexander and his empire. Now, he still needed good circumstances. The success of his conquest was predicated upon structural preconditions that he inherited from his father, Philip II, and it was predicated on the systemic vulnerabilities of the 4th century Persian Empire. So there had to be certain historical prerequisites, but Alexander himself was an incredibly impressive military mind. He had talents that are rare, and they are matched by a few rare individuals across the millennia. People like Genghis Khan, Khalid ibn al-Walid, and Napoleon Bonaparte. So, to really understand how a pop-up empire comes to be, we have to analyze both the circumstances that create the foundation for conquest and the talents the founder needs. And then to understand its collapse, we got to talk once again about the importance of institutions. So, Let's get going by addressing the circumstances that create the potential for empire. Alexander didn't just inherit a crown, he inherited a potential world-conquering machine. We like to imagine that he started from zero, but he was standing on the shoulders of a giant, his father Philip II. Before Philip, Macedonia was a hodgepodge militia and a regional backwater, constantly bullied by its neighbors. Philip transformed it into one of the most sophisticated professional armies in the Greek world. He required 1 in every 10 able-bodied men to serve under regular pay and training, creating a force that lived and breathed war. He also invented the tactical hammer and anvil doctrine, where an impenetrable wall of infantry armed with 18 to 20 foot sarissa pikes, that's 5 to 6 meters in European, double the length of the standard Greek spears, would pin the enemy in place, while the elite companion cavalry delivered the killing blow. Hammer and anvil. By the time Alexander took over, Philip had already used the League of Corinth to unify the Greek city-states, providing a secure home base and a pan-Hellenic war of revenge narrative that gave Alexander the political mandate to invade Asia. On the other side of the Hellespont, the Achaemenian Persian Empire was basically a house of cards ready to fall. While it looked massive and wealthy on a map, it was riddled with internal political divisions and a crisis of legitimacy. King Darius III had ascended the throne following a blood-soaked transition that left many provincial governors or satraps questioning his authority. This decentralized system meant that when Alexander arrived, many satraps were more interested in protecting their own estates than coordinating a unified defense. Ironically, the very infrastructure the Persians built to manage their vast realm worked against them in this war. Alexander used the sophisticated network of Persian royal roads to move his army at lightning speeds throughout the empire. He didn't even have to build a new government. The Persian administrative and fiscal systems were so well established that he could simply plug and play, adopting their titles and keeping local elites in power to ensure money and supplies kept flowing to his army, and he could just keep going east. If we look at a few other pop-up empires, Genghis Khan's rise was similarly fueled by a perfect alignment of internal and external decay. He found the Mongolian tribal world in a cycle of fragmentation and ready for a leader to unify them into a disciplined military state. At the exact same moment, his primary targets, the Jin dynasty in China and other settled states, were simultaneously in decline and riddled with internal weakness. This created an external power vacuum that Genghis, an ambitious and determined genius, was able to exploit, turning a collection of mutually hostile nomadic tribes into the most lethal military force on the planet, just as his neighbors were busy rotting from within and thus unable to stop him. For Napoleon, the right circumstances were the pure, unadulterated chaos of the French Revolution. He was a product of a system that had shredded the old social hierarchy, replacing it with a meritocracy where a kid from a minor family in Corsica could actually rise through the ranks based on talent rather than noble birth. The revolution's reign of terror had conveniently cleared out the senior noble generals, leaving a massive leadership gap for the young, brilliant artillery officer to fill. By 1799, The governing directory was so weak and corrupt and paralyzed by political infighting that France was desperate for a strong man to restore order, effectively handing Napoleon a power vacuum that he was more than happy to step into. And externally, all of Europe had been rocked by the French Revolution. Every crowned head in Europe stared at their people with fear, wondering if they would be next. And there were indeed agitators in all European countries. Revolutionary fervor was sweeping Europe and causing instability in all of Napoleon's potential conquests. Okay, so in each case, you have a home base that is ready for military leadership, and you have some kind of external weakness in target countries that look strong and that have a strong history, but are now no longer have that internal strength. But, like I said, it wasn't just circumstance. I don't think anyone other than Alexander could have created his empire. If Napoleon hadn't unified France, someone else would have, but I don't think they would have created an empire. If another nomad rose to control the Mongols, I'm not sure they would have achieved the same success as Genghis Khan. I think there was, in fact, something somewhat special about each of these men, and they exploited the circumstances in a way that no one else could have. But before we unpack what makes them special, give me one moment to invite you to sign up for my newsletter. It comes out 4 times a year, and it's not just a collection of videos I like. It includes original content about world building, an update of my writing projects and my thoughts on writing, a deep dive into a topic via a blog post, and much more. Also, all subscribers get a free novella every year. And you get to ask questions, which I will answer in the newsletter. So, follow the link down below and sign up for Marie's Deep Thoughts. It's completely free, and you will receive this year's free book, Thief's Magic. Okay, and now let's talk about conquering warriors. Alexander was, in every sense, a warrior spirit, trained by the best minds of his age. While he inherited a powerful machine, he was the one who knew how to redline it. His greatest tactical asset was a quality the Greeks called photos, an insatiable, almost supernatural drive for the unattainable. This translated into a military doctrine of speed and surprise that the ancient world simply wasn't prepared for. Alexander was a front-line commander. He didn't just point from a hill. He led the elite companion cavalry at the literal tip of the wedge formation, often being the first over a city's walls. This created a psychological bond with his men that allowed him to push them through 50 miles a day forced marches through deserts and mountains that should have been impassable. He was also a logistical genius who realized that baggage trains are the death of speed. He ditched the slow-moving ox cart of his predecessors and made his soldiers carry their own gear, replacing oxen with the faster horses and camels. Whether he was building a half-mile causeway to conquer the impregnable island of Tyre, or using torsion catapults to clear mountain strongholds in India, his ability to improvise solutions on the fly was what kept his momentum from ever stalling. On the Asian side of the world, Genghis Khan's unique brilliance was his social revolution. He recognized that the traditional tribal system was a recipe for failure. So he smashed it and replaced it with a strict meritocracy where talent mattered more than birthright. He organized his army on a precise decimal system and built the YAM postal system, a Pony Express style network that allowed him to coordinate multi-pronged invasions across thousands of miles with near-modern synchronization. Genghis was also a master of psychological warfare. He would use misinformation, like lighting thousands of extra campfires, to make his army look 10 times its size, to break the enemy's resolve before the first arrow was even fired. Napoleon, meanwhile, was the ultimate refiner of warfare. He had a memory for detail that was bordering on computer-esque. He could reportedly recall the exact location and strength of every one of his units across a massive front without even looking at a map. His unique contribution to warfare was the corps system, dividing his army into smaller, self-sufficient mini-armies that could move independently and then concentrate at lightning speed for a decisive battle. This allowed him to outmaneuver the rigid, linear armies of the old European monarchies who were still fighting by 18th century rules. He was also a master of meaning management. And by that I mean he used medals, awards, and his personal charisma to convince his soldiers that they weren't just fighting for France. They were fighting for glory and freedom. He controlled the war narrative. What I think each of these men had in common is a combination of ambition, intelligence, and a capacity for military insight combined with immense personal courage. They could take common military problems and see new solutions. Each of them innovated with their forces. They didn't just apply existing strategies well, and that was the difference between them and everyone they warred with. And they were willing to take risks that made other men reevaluate their whole lives. Hence the courage. But brilliance in one field does not equate to perfection in all things, and none of these men built empires that lasted. And it's all for the same reason: lack of institutional consolidation. So let's talk about the pop-up, plopping down. The problem with an empire built on a single person's charisma is that it doesn't have a save button. In sociology, this is what Max Weber called charismatic authority, power that comes from an individual's extraordinary personal qualities rather than established laws or offices. Charismatic authority is inherently unstable because it dies with the person that has it. If you haven't converted that personal loyalty that people have to you into rational legal authority, things like courts, bureaucracies, and clear succession laws, the second the great man stops breathing, the whole map resets. Alexander is a perfect case study in this succession void. He died at just 32 in Babylon without a viable heir. His half-brother was disabled and his son wasn't even born yet. When his general supposedly asked on his deathbed who should inherit his crown, as I said at the top, he reportedly whispered, "To the strongest, toi crastissio." Something like that. My ancient Greek is worse than my Latin, so sorry, Greeks. Anyway, whether he actually said it or his generals made this up in order to justify their own ambition, it was the ultimate middle finger to stability. Within days, his top commanders, the Daidotchi, were already carving up the satrapies in the partition of Babylon, which was less a peace treaty and more of a countdown to a 40-year civil war. Because Alexander's governance was plug and play, as I said, he just inserted himself into existing Persian hierarchies. There were no new Macedonian institutions to hold the empire together once the King of Kings was gone. The personal bonds Alexander created with local elites vanished, and the empire fragmented into 3 or 4 competing kingdoms, like the Ptolemaic Egyptian and the Seleucid Empire, and they spent the next few centuries fighting each other until Rome eventually mopped them up. And you know how Rome survived as long as it did? Do you know? Institutions. I've had people in my comments singing about how feudalism is amazing, and my problem with feudalism is exactly its lack of institutions. It all comes down to your local lord and how he runs his fiefdom, and that's no way to run a railroad. Institutions are critical to stable governance. Sorry. Back to pop-up empires and their plop downs. We see the same one-man show failure over and over. Attila the Hun built a terrifying power base through sheer personal might, but within a single year of his death in 453 CE, his sons were fighting each other, and his subject tribes were in open revolt. The Hunnic Empire didn't just decline, it basically vanished from history. In the 14th century, Tamerlane, conquered from Turkey all the way to India, but because he ruled through personal ties and fear rather than centralized bureaucracy, his empire shattered into tiny warring city-states the moment he died in 1405. Even Genghis Khan, who was the most successful at planning for the future, couldn't keep the pop-up unified. He at least had the sense to use a Kurultai, a tribal council, for succession. But even that couldn't stop the Mongol Empire from eventually splitting into 4 separate Khanates. Because of the sheer size of the conquest, it was just too much for one person who wasn't Genghis Khan to hang on to. As for Napoleon, his empire was absolutely a house of cards held together by his own tactical refinement and his skill at keeping his men loyal. The second his military luck ran out at Waterloo, the French borders snapped right back to where they were before he started. I will insert a caveat here. Napoleon actually did create some institutions that outlived his empire, like the Napoleonic Civic Code. So, though the French Empire died with Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon certainly left his mark. The same with Genghis Khan and Alexander. Their empires vanished, but they had lasting effects on the world nonetheless. Think of the impact of the Golden Horde on the world, or the fact that we have a chunk of cities that are all named after Alexander. So, the empires die, but that doesn't mean the conquerors had no lasting impact. For us as world builders, I think the lesson is reasonably clear. If your villain or hero builds an empire based on their personal charisma, they aren't really building a state. They're building a very large personality cult. And without the boring stuff like tax codes, civil service, and clear airs, in other words, without institutions, their empire is just a very impressive flash in the pan. That being said, don't forget the caveat of lasting impacts. So in summary, if you want a pop-up empire, a one-and-done conquest, lay the groundwork of a state ready to unify with external opponents who look powerful outside of that inner group, but who are in fact riddled with internal weakness. Then create a character that has immense charisma and a deeply innovative mind and oodles of courage. Because I promise you, the one thing all of these men shared is that they were willing to roll the dice with fate itself. Then make sure that those men conquer fast and die young before they created meaningful institutions. And Bob's your uncle, Fanny's your aunt. the whole thing rips apart in a few decades. And remember, just because the empire vanished doesn't mean the conqueror in the heart of it didn't have a material impact on the world. Think of it this way. The container, the empire, breaks, but the contents, the culture, spill out and soak into the soil of history. History will remember those conquests, even if the empire doesn't last. And now, while the names of the amazing members of the channel scroll past, let me tell you about Khalid ibn al-Walad, the Sword of Allah. Khalid is unique among history's great military minds because he simultaneously took on two superpowers of the Seventh Empire, the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Persian Empire, and he shattered both of them. Khalid's greatest advantage was in mobility. He treated the Arabian desert like a sea, using camels to move his troops through waterless terrain that the Romans and the Persians considered impassable. The Battle of Yarmouk in 636 AD is considered his masterpiece. Faced with a massive multi-ethnic Byzantine army, Khalid used a series of attritional maneuvers over 6 days to draw them into a decisive engagement. He used his mobile guard, an elite cavalry unit, to strike with surgical precision, ultimately annihilating the Byzantine force and ending their rule in Syria. So why isn't he on my list of one-and-done conquerors? Because he was only ever a general. Unlike Alexander or Napoleon, Khalid did not decide where to expand or how to govern. He was a commander for the first two caliphs, Abu Bakr and Umar. In fact, Caliph Umar famously demoted and dismissed Khalid from his command at the height of his career, specifically to prevent the rise of a personality cult and to ensure the army remained loyal to the state rather than a single individual. So, an incredible military mind, on par with the empire builders I mentioned in the script. But for him, the circumstances were not right to create a pop-up empire of his own, and so he is only remembered as a great general. If you made it this far, leave a crown emoji in the comments, and don't forget to hype or thumbs up the video, or both if you're feeling generous. If you're looking for more content from me, check out my compilation video on the birth, growth, and death of empire. It's 4 hours long. You'll enjoy it. And I will see you soon for another episode of Just in Time World Building.